Welcome to the Intrusions Indepth podcast. I'm Josh Stepp. Today we continue our multi-part series on Phineas Fisher's infamous cyber attacks. In the third episode, we'll not only explore the details of the attacks, but also examine how the victims responded and what led up to them. Unlike the previous two episodes, Episode 1, Gamma Group, and Episode 2, Hacking Team, I'll be jumping around a bit in the timeline and covering 3 attacks in one episode. The reason for this is that 2 of them are loosely connected, and the last attack was only really a video. There's not much information reported outside of that. The Turkey AKP email release is extremely odd, and I want to spend some time looking into that and going over some of the historical significance. Now, join me as we delve into the story of Phineas Fisher taking on the state and robbing a bank. But before we do that, let's not get sued.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
2016, as I've said a few times on this podcast, was a busy and odd year. It was the run-up to the Trump-Clinton election that would ultimately surprise most of the world when President Trump would be declared the winner. WannaCry and NotPetya showed everyone the power of destructive ransomware worms and how negligent state-sponsored hacking crews can be. The shadow brokers and Guccifer 2.0 were running around pretending not to be Russian while failing miserably at English and Romanian and how to use VPNs. WikiLeaks was publishing damaging information to the DNC here in the United States. Panama Papers were released. Russia and Turkey were mad at each other. Turkey had shot down a Su-24 jet, killing the pilot in late 2015. Russia claimed that the jet was in Syrian airspace doing Russian things for Syria. Turkey claimed that they told the pilot to change its heading numerous times, but shot it down once it violated their airspace. The U.S., for what it's worth, agreed with Turkey. They're a NATO ally, after all. And I'm not throwing shade here. I just don't think that would shock anyone. If they did think that the Russians were in the right, they probably just wouldn't have said anything. Or maybe they just would have backed Turkey anyway to get under the Russian skin. Who knows? Plus, Russia has a history of kind of messing with geofencing data and kind of spoofing this stuff. So what I'm trying to say is it's hard to know who's telling the truth here, although I lean on the side of NATO. Either way, Russia put sanctions on Turkish food and banned tourism to Turkey. President Erdogan was not in good graces with the West either, after becoming more authoritarian with the crackdown on media and jailing activists. These are the Gulen activists that we talked about in the last episode. And we're going to go deeper on Turkish history in a minute. But eventually, President Erdogan caved and gave an apology to the pilot's family and to Russia. Then the failed coup happens, WikiLeaks gets involved, and, well, things just get really odd. Now let's talk about Turkey. The dump and release of the AK Party emails is lacking in technical details, which admittedly is where I'm most comfortable providing analysis. However, in order to understand the significance of this incident and why this incident contributed to the Russian identity theory of Phineas Fisher, I need to spend a few minutes explaining the long and violent history of conflict between the Turkish and Kurdish people in modern-day Turkey. The reason I say the Russian theory is because a listener who wishes to remain anonymous emailed more details and some analysis of the Russian theory to me after I released the last episode. Now, admittedly, I'm still marinating on it, and I think the best course of action would be to do a standalone podcast for it next, instead of my planned part 4. Which, by the way, is freaking awesome. I started this podcast to kind of push myself intellectually, and this type of engagement leaves me at a loss of words to really express my level of gratitude. I never would have assumed that 300 people more would listen to a podcast episode that I put out. And the response has kind of been overwhelming, hitting over 1,000 downloads. And for that, just thanks to anyone that took the time out of their day to listen to this. or to respond back and interact with what I'm saying. I really appreciate it. But let's get to the Turkey history. As Carl Sagan once quoted, you have to know the past to understand the present, which is incredibly true in the case of the Middle East. The Kurdish autonomous zones that Phineas Fisher was involved in have a long, long history. I think it's best to explain this as most people, especially in the West, aren't taught this type of information. They've never heard of autonomous zones until some people got together in Seattle and made one, complete with bags of water and a garden that didn't look like it could sustain that many people, especially the people that called it home. Now, I'm no expert, but I've played enough Age of Empires to know that you need to be able to sustain your economy to keep things going. I assure you that Mojave is very different. Now, this is going to go over 100 years of history, so it could easily be a podcast series in itself with hours and hours of content. I'm going to try and cover the important bits for our purposes. Now, going back to World War I, yep, you heard that correctly, the First World War. The Ottoman Empire was, for all extensive purposes, gone. One piece of land that they occupied was a historic and geographically important location called Anatolia. It's bound by the Black Sea to the north, the Mediterranean Sea to the south, and the Aegean Sea to the west. Historically, this land has been a region of great importance and has seen numerous civilizations and empires, like the Hittites, Persians, Greek, Romans, Byzantines, and of course the Ottomans. I'm probably missing some there. But having a large group of people over the years settled the area, and then when new borders are drawn, conflicts can arise. Kind of a common trend in the Middle East. Two groups of people in particular were the Kurdish people and the Armenian people that lived in what is now modern-day Turkey, as well as with the Turkish people. The Armenians are a Christian minority. So when the Ottoman Empire joined forces with the Germans and Austrians and Hungarian factions of the war, the Muslim Empire feared that they would be betrayed and be closely aligned to the Christian Russians. The Russians at this time were fighting opposite of the Ottoman Empire and on the side of the US, the UK, France, Italy, and Japan. I may have missed a country there, but we get the point. Now, fearing this, the Ottoman Empire ramped up the already periodic violence on the Christian minority group. Now, ramped up is a bit of an understatement. They arrested and executed Armenian leaders and intellectuals in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. They forced deported men, women, and children from their homes and forced them on these death marches through the Syrian desert. Most of them died, and the ones that were able to make it to the concentration camps, well, there's stories of them just awaiting mass killings or being poisoned. There's also accounts of burning people alive and other just horrific ways to kill someone. It's believed that the Armenian genocide resulted in an estimated 1.5 million deaths, and their wealth was being confiscated, which is common when these types of things occur. Now, when the Turkish government formed after the war in 1923, they denied all of this happening. Other countries recognized this event, like the United States. So when Turkey formed after the First World War, the native Turks declared Anatolia as part of their territory. This is where most of their major cities are in Turkey in the present day. It's also why Turkey wields so much influence in Europe and NATO. They're geographically and strategically important for the alliance in the area. Another ethnic group in the area, the Kurds, still there in their native lands, made up of parts of Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq during the formation of Turkey, was present and had to know about what was going on. Now, the borders in the Middle East really don't help things either. The Kurdish people are ethnically different group than the Turkish people. They have their own beliefs, language, culture, etc. However, the Turkish government, through various leaders, have played a version of good cop, bad cop over the years. Bad cop when they pass laws prohibiting the use of the language or even acknowledging cultural differences between the people. Or good cop when they run for office and talk about giving Kurdish people a seat or a voice in the government. Most of the time, this was the result of violence and bloodshed. The Kurdish resistance, especially through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, met the Turkish authorities with insanely effective guerrilla-style insurgency. A Kurdish leader rose during this time. His name was Abdullah Öcalan. He is the founder and the leader of the Kurdish Workers' Party, PKK, a Kurdish militant and political organization in Turkey. The PKK is the Kurdish guerrilla resistance group and is labeled as a terrorist organization within Turkey, as well as the United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, and numerous other countries. Öcalan founded the PKK based on the writings of Lenin and Marx. He wanted the Kurds to have their own socialist state, independent of Turkey. And if you've studied those writings, there's an oversimplified tenet within them that says that the need for violence can be used as a way to kind of get your point across. Now, this puts Turkey in a very complicated position. It's the old one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist debate. Turkey's forced assimilation plan was only making things worse with the Kurdish people, especially the PKK. The violence, which Turkey saw as justified, as this was occurring within their borders and targeted their civilians, was pretty brutal. Furthermore, the PKK had adopted an extremely effective strategy of suicide bombers, and they targeted government officials and highly populated civilian targets. One of those was Zeynep Kenichi. And I think I'm pronouncing that wrong. I've only really read it. A female suicide bomber, believed to kind of be the first female suicide bomber from the PKK. And she targeted a military parade and killed 6 people and wounded 33. Now, as much as I'm not a fan of suicide bombers and the tactic, and also understand that there's some cultural beliefs that aren't my own, this action is kind of seen as sort of a woman empowerment movement for the Kurdish resistance fighters. The PKK used both women and men fighters. And due to Turkey's primary use of just men, this made their numbers actually very comparable. Eventually, Öcalan was captured and put into a prison. There's some controversy there about American assets being used in the embassy, but let's skip that part. So the leader of the PKK was put into a prison in 1999 to the present day, and his writings still are influential to the PKK movement, even from his cell. Now, as what is, I guess, pretty common when people have a lot of time to reflect on things when they're sitting on a jail cell, Öcalan kind of changed his views, and he went from the Lenin, Marx views to adopting more of a libertarian view for the Kurdish state. Now, let's fast forward to 2011. Remember I said the Kurdish people lived in parts of Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq? Well, in 2011, a bloody Syrian civil war erupted. And during the fighting, Kurdish people in the regions established an autonomous zone called Rojava, as the Syrian government left that area. Officially, this area is called the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, ANAS, but I'm going to be calling it Rojava for this episode. Now, obviously, Turkey wasn't excited about having an organized Kurdish population on their border, and they established some buffer zones. The Rojava zone, modeled on PKK and Öcalan views of how a society should function, established 2 fighting forces: the People's Protection Unit, the YPG, and the Women's Protection Unit, the YPJ. YPG being all male and YPJ being all female. This made their fighting force somewhere near 100,000 strong. And with their strong views of gender equality and guerrilla warfare tactics learned from decades of combat with the Turkish government as PKK soldiers, these forces are seen as being quite formidable. Then a bigger problem arose for everyone in the region: the formation and conquest of ISIL or ISIS, whatever you want to call them. Don't worry, we're getting to the end, I promise. I'm just going to call them ISIS. They started their conquest over the Iraqi border and through Syria in their band of Toyota pickup trucks and captured tanks and bulldozers, kind of like an Islamic blitzkrieg. However, they quickly found out that the Kurdish people live by the military doctrine of FAFO. I'll let you look that up. Now, I'm going to be completely biased here and a little vague. I personally have a lot of respect for the bravery and courage and fighting ability of these forces. I don't agree with all their ideals or anything like that, and don't espouse to understanding their cultural differences. I don't believe that the Kurds get anywhere near the respect for their role in doing the dirty work to take out ISIS, especially the courage of the YPJ units. I don't think I need to tell you that fighting extremists like ISIS is dangerous for everyone involved. We've all seen or heard about the videos of them torturing people, burning them alive, beheadings, mass shootings, barbaric stuff targeting US journalists, Jordanian pilots, and just other people they seemed undesirable. Sometimes I think having social media and cell phones, giving everyone a television studio in their pocket, has led to the worst in humanity being amplified. But for the YPJ forces in particular, the all-female force, this takes an insane level of courage and tenacity and just commitment. ISIS fighters aren't going to take nicely to fighting women and could be especially more brutal in their treatment of captives. This isn't a surprise, and these women, they knew this when they took up arms against them, and they did it anyway. The United States, along with an unprecedented coalition of other nation states, came together to stop ISIS. I'm talking the US, France, Russia, Turkey, Hezbollah, Iran. They all partnered with the Kurdish forces in the area, as they were extremely effective against this shared army. Yes, I did say Hezbollah. Now, to be fair, this was like different forces and different fronts. I mean, the Iranian side was primarily led by Soleimani. Now, ISIS ruled over like 8 to 12 million people at the time, and they were pulling in close to $1 billion a year. That's a lot of money for a terrorist organization, especially after they captured Mosul. They were armed with American weapons at this point and full of stolen cash from the banks. The United States led some air campaigns against ISIS while dropping supplies to the Kurdish forces on the ground. Well, first, the United States led airstrikes against ISIS targets after they had like 50,000 Yazidis people trapped on a mountain facing certain death. The Kurdish forces evac those people as well. Now, this was after ISIS had killed like 5,000 men and boy Yazidis and put the 10,000 women and girls in forced slavery. Eventually, U.S. troops and special forces were on the ground as well, fighting alongside the Kurdish YPG and YPJ forces. And during this time, hostilities from Turkey were non-existent, as they led operations against ISIS, but also knew that the United States was in the area, and I guess they just didn't want to be as direct. Eventually, ISIS was defeated, things calmed down a bit, and U.S. forces were withdrawn. The Turkish government and the Rojavi-led Kurds still have conflicts to this day. Now, we also need to talk about President Erdogan, as he's the leader of the AKP, or the AK Party. It's Justice and Development Party. It's a conservative political party that's been in control since 2002. Now, Erdogan has authoritarian tendencies, to say the least. And sometimes that's out of place, especially leading a country that's part of NATO. Erdogan isn't a fan of the Rojavi state, and Kurdish people and the AKP have had numerous violent encounters over the years. It's complicated, as this has been a decades-long conflict with bloodshed on both sides and borders and responsibilities of states getting in the way. Numerous military operations have been launched by Turkey under Erdogan to clear out the established buffer zones or make them bigger and kind of separate the distance between Rojavi and Turkey. But let's go back to 2016. How does Phineas Fisher get involved? Man, that got long. I hope I didn't bore you all too much with this Turkish history lesson. Phineas supported the movement of the Rojavi region and the hardship of the Kurdish people. I don't think this is much of a stretch to see why. Phineas Fisher has quoted other collective groups with different ways of struggle, mostly violent ways, like the CMT, the Spanish Union. However, what was odd to me is, why do this attack? Now, we don't have a manifesto for this attack, so technical details are scarce. But why Turkey? Why in support of the Kurdish people? This was 2016, the same year of the President Erdogan coup. Well, this attack is why some analysts believe Phineas Fisher was a Russian asset. Like I said earlier, I'm going to devote an entire episode to this theory next, once I organize my thoughts on it. But let's start with a brief timeline. Now, July 15th, 2016, the Turkish coup attempt happens. On the evening of July 15th, a faction within the Turkish military attempted a coup against President Erdogan. On the night of July 15th and into the 16th, the coup was suppressed after intense clashes between the forces, and up to about 300 people died, and there was a detention of thousands. Now, July 19th, 2016, WikiLeaks publishes a database of 300,000 emails from Turkey's ruling Justice and Development Party, the AKP. The emails were reportedly obtained through the coup attempt, but were published shortly after it. Now, this is not even a week after that. Now, Phineas Fisher further collaborates this in an article with Vice Motherboard. Quote, "To be fair to WikiLeaks, they didn't know that I was still in the AKP's network downloading files at the time they announced that they were publishing," Phineas Fisher wrote in his message. "But they did know that the source who was given the files was asking them to wait." End quote. So this is plausible. Taking the Occam's razor approach, this is the simplest explanation and probably should be our starting point. WikiLeaks was chasing the scoop, publishing early to become relevant in the Turkish news cycle, I bet. And after all, following the coup attempt, Turkey was in a state of emergency with extensive purges and crackdowns on the various sectors, including the military, judges, academia, media, etc. Now, WikiLeaks' release of the emails just days after the coup attempt added to political turmoil, revealing internal communications and politically sensitive information. It also led to Turkey banning the website. But then details about how President Erdogan was notified about the coup took place. I'm using an article from the Moscow Times, independent news from Russia. Despite the name, I think it's supposed to be fairly serious and not a Babylon Bee type of organization, but it's kind of got the most information. That's why I want to use it. Now, according to the article, Russian intelligence agencies received information about the coup before it began and sent it to the Turkish government. A source said they intercepted radiograms of the Turkish military's plan as part of continued operations against ISIS in the area from their base in Syria. Russia was helping Syria at the time, and Russia was one of the many nations that contributed to the fall of ISIS. Russia still gets frequent attacks from the ISIS franchises, especially ISIS-K or ISIS Khorasan, to this day. They somehow managed to blame Americans and Ukrainians for these attacks, but hey, I'm doing my own mental gymnastics here right now, so I'm going to focus there. So this led to people kind of being suspicious. Russians are great at propaganda. So sure, this account could be correct, but they could have also gotten this information another way. Maybe like an inside op. Oh, and those WikiLeaks emails have a ton of malware in them, as pointed out by a security researcher. I'll link the GitHub that has like the text document with all of them. I don't know if it's because the AKP party was terrible with email controls or WikiLeaks or someone planted the malware in them, but it's just kind of nuts. Then we have the dump of Phineas released independently of the emails and independently of WikiLeaks, which, unlike the Gamma Group or Hacking Tea dumps, had no real significance. Worse, they may have made things more dangerous for people. According to the book Cult of the Dead Cow by Joseph Menn, there was a database of almost all the women in Turkey, as well as their phone numbers and addresses. So you could make some concessions here. Phineas was rushed, didn't speak the language, but it does look odd. When questioned about why hack the AKP, it was to support the autonomous zones controlled by the Kurds. That feels like a big risk, in my opinion. People are passionate about all kinds of things. And Phineas did put their money where their mouth was, and they donated 10,000 euros at the time, 25 Bitcoin, to the region of Rojava for their support. But where did Phineas Fisher get this money? Well, they stole it from a bank.
It's Phineas Phineas Fisher, yeah, I'm back in the scene. A hacker on a mission, disrupting the machine. Hacking team took him down with finesse. For the rules and the truth, man, you know I confess. Read the Citizen Lab, saw the messed up report. Fisher and the others, just a crooked cohort. I don't do it for the fame, not for the glory. Just to give the targets a break, that's my story.
Anti-surveillance, yeah, that's my fight. Exposing all of that.
In 2016, Phineas Fisher struck again. This time, their target was a bank in the Isle of Man, the Cayman National Bank, in what Phineas Fisher later described as an act of ethical robbery. They breached the bank systems and made off with money and sensitive documents. This is kind of like Boeing's technical escapes. I just love the wordplay here. But Phineas Fisher didn't just steal for personal gain. In a remarkable twist, they actually gave stolen funds away. As we discussed earlier, one of those recipients was the autonomous Kurdish zones. As they put in their manifesto, I robbed a bank and gave the money away. Computer hacking is a powerful tool to fight economic inequality. Phineas Fisher claims to have stolen the documents and the money way back in 2016, but this only really came to light in 2019 when Phineas Fisher published their manifesto and shared the stolen data with the activist group Distributed Denial of Secrets. We're going to talk more about that site, Emma Best, aka NatSecGeek's work, in the next episode. The leak contained gigabytes of internal documents and emails that provide a rare glimpse into the shadowy world of offshore banking. It exposed the bank's wealthy clients and some of the questionable business practices, although that's a little bit of a stretch. For its part, the Cayman National Bank confirmed that it had been the victim of a criminal hack and said it was cooperating with law enforcement to investigate. But the damage was done. The leak generated global headlines and raised uncomfortable questions about the secrecy of the offshore industry. Once again, Phineas Fisher had struck a blow against what they saw as the pillar of global inequality, the international financial systems that allow the rich to shield their wealth from taxes and scrutiny. It was a characteristically bold and provocative move by the hacktivists. Now, by stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, Phineas Fisher styled himself as kind of like a digital Robin Hood, leveraging their hacking skills to wage one-person war against economic injustice. But it also showed how a lone attacker could pierce the defenses of a well-resourced financial institution. It was also a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities in our interconnected digital world and the power of skilled and motivated attackers to exploit them for ideological gains. This is something I think about. How often do these banks get breached or discover it and stop it versus just calling it like an operating expense? After reading books like The Lazarus Heist by Jeff White, discussing the North Korean bank robbery, a future episode, and hearing how Phineas reverse engineered the SWIFT protocol procedures by just watching, this seems disturbingly simple. Can we not segment the money system and the IT systems like you see in an ICS environment? Something like an MT and an IT concept, like the OT and IT system and ICS, operational technology and information technology, and an industrial control system for those that don't like acronyms. I know the likelihood of that information seeing the light of day is scarce, but like I said, I've kind of always wondered about it. Like the attacks on Gamma Group and Hacking Team, Phineas Fisher wrote another manifesto or guide as a way to describe their methods for their attack, while also acting as a call to arms for fellow attackers. Also, like the Hacking Team manifesto, this one had more thoughts and opinions sprinkled in. Phineas starts by telling us that the bank was the target of opportunity. In other words, it wasn't targeted. They had no specific intention of going after this bank instead of others. Phineas Fisher was scanning the internet for vulnerable devices, found some, and liked this one because it had the word Cayman in its title. Now, remember the shell-shock sonic wall device from Hacking Team that Phineas Fisher used? Well, the same exploit was used here. However, unlike Hacking Team, the Cayman Bank used their Windows credentials to auth instead of a one-time password. So by adding some C code into their backdoor, they provided the code. Phineas was able to wrap the login page and record the credentials of people logging in. This is a favorite tactic of Phineas. One of those users was the domain admin, and Phineas Fisher was able to collect the password for them. Now, I'm going to quote from the manifesto as this further supports my point I made earlier. Quote, interesting, from following the investigation of the hack, it seems someone else may have independently compromised the bank around the same time that I did with the targeted phishing email. As the old saying goes, give someone an exploit and they'll have access for a day, teach them to fish and they'll have access for life. Also, that someone else randomly targeted the same small bank at the same time I did, they registered a domain similar to the bank's real one to send the phishing from, suggests that the bank hacks are happening way more often than what's being reported. End quote. So it seems that this bank had lots of threat actors in their network, or at least targeting them. As crazy as this sounds, this happens more likely than you would like to imagine. I've pieced together attacks across different spans of days of different groups using different TTPs, but getting the same data. And this is always a fun conversation. They call you in there and it's like, yeah, this attack you called us for, well, it did happen. And this one also happened too, 3 months earlier. That's a rough way to start your day if you're a CISO. One of the things that's always stood out to me about the way Phineas Fisher operated was their unique ways of maintaining access, persistent. Most of the time, you expect run keys in the registry, hidden payloads, startup scripts, artifacts on disk. In the hacking team hack, they picked a process that's always on and just process injected into it and just stayed there. With this Cayman Island bank attack, they used a PowerShell Empire payload connecting back to a primary IP address for most of their dirty work. A Meterpreter payload connected back to a secondary IP address that was used slightly, and there was a third or tertiary IP address that they didn't touch and sent commands to once a day or less to maintain access. Now, when the bank ran IR, they found the Meterpreter and Empire payloads, but not the low and slow payload. Phineas saw that they put network monitoring on the network, so they reduced their traffic and connections. But with the access, it was time to figure out how to steal the money. Now, the attacker first set out looking for files and emails with the word Swift and wire and words like that to go and figure out the process. However, the most useful tool was keylogging and screen recording. Luckily, Microsoft provided this functionality through the use of Problem Steps Recorder, or PSR.exe. Although this is slightly creepy, it was built first, like most things, as a way to make people's lives easier. Instead of having a user explain the issue over the phone, they could record the issue, as well as having a log of all their actions and the name of the window tiles, packaged up and just sent to a tech. Well, attackers found out that you could trigger this remotely and covertly, so the user has no clue that it's even running. Doing this over a long enough period gave Phineas Fisher insight into how the Swift transaction process is operated, one step closer to stealing the money. Quoting from the manifesto again, they were using a remote Citrix app from Bottomline to access the Swift network, where each Swift MT103 payment message had to pass through 3 employees. One to create the message, one to verify it, and one to authorize it. Since I had all their credentials thanks to the keylogger, I could easily do all 3 of those steps myself. And as far as I could tell from watching them work, they did not review the sent Swift messages. So I should have enough time to get the money out of the bank before they drop notices and try to reverse the wires. End quote. Well, that didn't seem hard. But knowing how to understand the account names or code was something that appeared to be more institutional knowledge, something Phineas didn't have. As they outlined in the manifesto, they had to learn it on the fly as they were going. The first 2 wires went through without a hitch, which is awesome for achieving your goals, but terrible in that it gives you a false sense of, I know what I'm doing. I got this. I think we can all relate. The next day, a wire transfer to Mexico was attempted and failed. The bank used their corresponding account at NatWest for international wires. Observing that the wires in Great Britain had a GPL listed as their correspondence, while others had account names without the GPL at the end. Assuming that the Great Britain wire to Mexico should use the GPL, Phineas didn't realize that GPL indicated the use of the UK-only faster payment service. So faster payment service cannot provide international wires. The bank also received an error message due to this assumption. Faster payment also burned Phineas Fisher when they tried to send a £200,000 transfer to a UK bank, but saw it was over the limit for that type of service. The bank received error messages for both these failed transactions. Upon investigation, they reviewed the error messages and discovered that the mistakes in the wire transfers and saw all the other transfers. The jig was up. Phineas then went on in the manifesto to explain that they had given the funds to various organizations and groups and wouldn't go into details about the figures or who it was to. This makes sense. No point in making the investigation against you easier. And if you feel a need to steal money for said groups, why would you make it easier for them to recover it? Phineas Fisher then went to encourage other groups to accept cryptocurrency as a form of donation these days, despite it looking kind of like a sort of hyper-capitalistic dystopian theme. The rest of the manifesto was talking about opinions of class structures and hierarchy, mental health, announcing a bug bounty, which seems odd, and recommended reading to help others answer their call to arm. Be better hackers. Admittedly, this manifesto lacked the technical analysis of Gamma Group and hacking team attacks. But then again, this attack was much simpler. You use a backdoor you already have, you get credentials, log in, keylog and take screenshots, log into the Swift terminals, send the money. This was also published 3 years post-breach. So maybe some of the details were foggy. I couldn't remember commands I ran 3 years ago, or 3 days ago. It also sounds like they took a break and took some time away from this line of work, which was good for them mentally, emotionally, and physically. That's a good thing. I've seen too many people become like shells of their former selves or do really destructive things under the pressure of mental health issues. I don't want anyone to suffer. I think Phineas has great advice here. Get out, connect with people, and meet space. Close the laptop. The one point I want to discuss is the bug bounty program. For someone who has remained at large despite attacking numerous targets and telling all, it seems brazen to offer this type of program. For multiple reasons. This exposes Phineas to the possibility of interacting with people as Phineas Fisher. Now, this is tricky. If you mess up connecting without your VPN or use the wrong alias, the possibility for getting caught is greatly increased. It would also make me think maybe Phineas Fisher has compromised himself. Maybe Phineas Fisher was an informant. If you were law enforcement, what's a better cover than paying people who report and tell you the crimes that they did? I'm not saying any of this is a fact, just saying that this is immediately where my mind goes. Informants, people working with law enforcement, seem to get away with crimes that everyone knows happen, but just nothing ever happens to them. And just to reiterate, I'm not claiming this as a fact. I'm just hypothesizing into the ether here. Now, this bug bounty program just felt like maybe Phineas had started to drink their own Kool-Aid. Although there were instances of a payout, it just felt like that if this took off, things could get real bad for Phineas. Sort of how I talked about with ISIS earlier. You make enough people mad, eventually you get to the point where they say enough is enough, and they take action. This bug bounty was pitched as a way for hackers to make money and support themselves by going out and doing some hacktivism, like Phineas Fisher had done, to provide an alternative to those not wanting to work for the man. While I think this sounds fun, this is also the portion where I want to remind everyone that this is highly illegal, all enforced by the man. So while your mileage may vary, you need to put that into your calculus. Now, some of the targets for this bug bounty were mining and lumber and cattle companies in Latin America, companies attacking Rojava, surveillance companies, NSO Group, war profiteers like Blackwater and Halliburton, private prison companies like Core Civic or CCA, and corporate lobbyists. Now, I doubt this would happen, but I would have loved to seen someone reply to like an attack on a company with an out-of-scope message. Or like if they managed to dump all AT&T's data, but then they found out it had all been dumped previously. Some of the actionable advice was unique. They talked about targeting investigative journalists lacking hard data. I would imagine that's to give them supporting information that they would need and thus garner a higher profile, like the hacking team emails that led to hacking team getting negative coverage. Another concept that was interesting was the idea of partial payments for like evil maids or those who set up keyloggers or who installed the hidden mics. It's an interesting idea. The execution seems tricky. This portion ended with wanting to acknowledge the imbalance in current hacking industries favoring those in power. They, Phineas Fisher, wanted to aim to turn ethical hacking into a multi-million-dollar industry to help balance the power, even if it didn't solve all the societal problems. Seems cool, but the legal issues and the idea of being added to like a spook's target list seems kind of daunting, especially for someone with like mental health issues already. Now, the manifesto ended with some ASCII art and a call to end prisons. I don't want to spend too much time discussing like societal issues or rebuffing these types of points. Phineas Fisher has their beliefs that drive them to do the types of things they do, like not being a fan of the police or the police union. And surely Phineas Fisher wouldn't attack a police union and steal data. Well, yes. Of course, Phineas Fisher would attack a police union and publish the information. And they did just that. In May of 2016, Phineas Fisher struck again. This time, their target was the Syndicate de Mossos de Escuadra, or SME, the police union of Catalonia, Spain. And sorry to the police union and every other person who had to listen to me butcher that. Phineas Fisher infiltrated the SME's website and downloaded a trove of sensitive information, including the personal details of police officers, like their names, addresses, bank account numbers. They claimed that most of the info was essentially public, but they could now be connected to specific badge numbers, unmasking the identities of the individual officers involved. Not content to just steal data, Phineas Fisher also defaced the SME's Twitter account and posted images of police brutality from the Mossos. It was also May 15th, a significant day in Spain, as the 5-year anniversary of the anti-austerity 15M movement. Now, the protests were happening across the country and in Catalonia. Now, 15M was a movement that emerged in response to like economic inequality, austerity measures, political corruption, and kind of a lack of true representation in the democratic system. It was kind of like movements like Occupy Wall Street or like the Arab Spring. Europe had some other austerity protests as well. Now, as Phineas Fisher put it in their video tutorial of the hack, most of us are probably too busy tear gassing protesters right now to pay attention to their server log. The SME website hack served multiple purposes for Phineas Fisher. It exposed the details of individual police officers connecting their identities to alleged acts of brutality. It drew attention to the heavy-handed police response to the 15N anniversary protests happening at the same moment. And crucially, it demonstrated to others how to execute this kind of hack themselves. Phineas Fisher, once again, published a detailed tutorial, this time as a video, nearly 40 minutes long, walking through each step of the process, sprinkled in with photos of their abuses carried out by the police. Now, watching the video, it starts with like OWASP ZAP and ensure that they're connected through Tor. OWASP ZAP, or as it's called today, ZAP or Z Attack Proxy, allows you to manipulate the traffic you send to a web page, which is great for attacking web applications. This assisted in finding the SQL or SQL injection used to attack the database in the video. Now, after finding some fields in the requests that looked prone to SQI, they set out with this and tested this hypothesis with SQL map. And lo and behold, they found a writable directory. They went about trying to upload a PHP shell, but it failed as they didn't have the right permissions. Never deterred by a setback, though, Phineas Fisher then proceeded to look for SQLI injection openings. They found an arbitrary file read. They dumped the PHP scripts for the target application. They found a standard PHP file upload vulnerability as published in FRAC that requires admin access. Using the SQL injection, they dumped the unsalted hashes for the admin's password and then cracked it. Now, salt is like a random value added to passwords before it's hashed. This allows for enhanced security as two users with the same password won't have the same hash. Unsalted passwords are thus easier to crack because they have less values in them, and the hash values are the same, so you kind of save time. But as Phineas Fisher points out, it's better for the environment to just backdoor pages. No need to do all that compute for hash breaking. Using the PHP shell, they dump the local database with the credentials found in the source code and steal files from bar www. They backdoor all of the login pages, and one of the stolen passwords was reused for their Twitter account. They also walked away with information on the police union. Phineas Fisher shared later in a motherboard interview for the article, a notorious hacker just released a how-to video targeting police by Joseph Hogg. Quote, "The one who shares what he learns is dangerous." End quote. That's what I should have titled this podcast. Phineas Fisher wanted to share their hacking knowledge and inspire others to launch politically motivated cyber attacks of their own. The SME hack was another example of Phineas Fisher's unique brand of hacktivism. Not just breaking into systems, but doing so expressly to expose abuse, support popular uprisings, and empower others to do the same. It was bold public action, bringing Phineas more notoriety, but also making them a target for law enforcement. In 2017, Phineas Fisher had emerged again, this time as being a 33-year-old man that was rounded up by the police in response to the actions of the hacker. It looked like the police had finally figured out who the notorious hacker was. However, Phineas Fisher told Motherboard's Lorenzo Franceschi Bicchiari that despite the claims of the three individuals being arrested by Spanish authorities on suspicion of being Phineas Fisher, that they were in fact alive, free, and well. Phineas Fisher also reiterated that they were a lone wolf, a single person. The whole interview was conducted via an encrypted chat, and Phineas was using the same handle that they had used with Motherboard since the hacking team attack in the summer of 2015, with the same unique encryption fingerprint. So this suggests that it was the same person. And I love that Motherboard understands that this would be a question that their audience asks, and they make sure to include it. Now, Phineas claimed no connection to the arrested people, but hypothesized that they were owners of some open proxies the attacker used for their attacks, perhaps on the police union. The video attack we just discussed. Phineas went on to say that the name has grown bigger than they were comfortable with, and it was getting stressful, keeping up with the identity in addition to their personal life. They then further elaborated on the mental and emotional toll this takes on you. Quote, "Hacking," they say, "has taken its toll since you have a double life. You have to hide from everyone around you." And that they added, quote, "causes some depression and stress," end quote. Now, I obviously have no experience in being a real black hat hacker, or do I? But I could definitely see how this could occur. We often hear fugitives thanking the police or feeling a sense of relief when they're finally captured after long stints of running from the law enforcement. Being in a heightened sense of paranoia and awareness, it's draining, and it ages you. Think about making sure that your VPN is always on, you're in the correct proxy, on the right Wi-Fi, using the right handles every time you interact with something as that identity. How many people check the Wi-Fi SSIDs every time they open their computer? Do you ever check the metadata from the Word documents you share? Did you check for the printer dots in that document you posted? What about stripping geolocation data from the photos you share? Yes, I know sites do that for you, but are you sure they don't have a copy of the original somewhere for law enforcement purposes? What about your recovery emails? Have you used those before? What's the recovery email? Is it your first dot last name at gmail.com? These are the stuff that gets people caught. In my personal experience, I've seen things traced back to people as they've attached like the wrong file to an RDP session, and thus we had copies of the receipts on all their RDP sessions or remote desktop sessions. Oh, and attackers, please always use remote desktop sessions. It's impossible to forensicate those, and they're the hardest to investigate. Now, Phineas went on to give us a glimpse of their day job, which we already knew as they told us back in the Hackback Manifesto for Hacking Team. Quote, "I live from computer crime because I don't have so much options for living with dignity within the system," Phineas Fisher said. "The political hacking I don't really see as work or doing it for a cause. More for me, it's just cathartic. It feels really good to F people up that are effing us up," end quote. And with that, Phineas Fisher also announced that they were kind of taking a break. As we learned in the manifesto published later in 2019 for the Isle of Bank hack, Phineas Fisher, or rather the person behind the keyboard, has suffered from depression and other mental health issues. So, I mean, good on them for spotting this and knowing when to take a step back. And that's from hoping for the best for someone's well being and knowing that people make mistakes or do irrational things when they're in the middle of like a mental episode or a mental attack. So, is this the end of Phineas Fisher? Did they ride off into the cyber sunset? Tip their hat, never to be seen again? Not exactly. Phineas Fisher resurfaced again in 2019. That's when the Hackback, a guide for robbing banks manifesto, was published after all. We'll cover more of the resurfaced attack and part 5 of the series. For the next part, I want to take a moment to explore the Russian government connection theory. It's interesting, and I think it garners further exploration, even if I still have questions and doubts. Like I said earlier, I'm not interested in trying to Scooby-Doo Phineas Fisher and find out who the person is behind the keyboard. But the AKP attack just felt weird to me. It was out of like character and slightly irrational. Turkey is a country, one backed by NATO, in the middle of geopolitics dumpster fire at the time, and just seems out of place compared to like surveillance companies or a bank and Spanish police union. But let's unravel those questions more next time. If you would like to hear more, please visit the website at intrusionsindepth.com, where you can find more stories on high-profile intrusions and the threat actors that conduct them. I'm Josh Stepp. Thanks for listening.
Rank the